So, epidemics. Most of us, to at least some degree, are familiar with epidemics, be it watching them in movies wipe out almost all of the human race, or seeing near-empty classrooms during flu season and fearing for the worst. The World Health Organization, an agency under the United Nations that specializes in international health, defines an epidemic as the occurrence of cases of a disease in excess of what would normally be expected in a defined community, geographical area, or season. To better understand what approaches we can best take in the future regarding epidemics, it is vital to understand our past and present. First, I'll be talking about the Zika virus. This virus is spread through the Aedes mosquitoes and is generally asymptomatic. However, when symptoms do appear, they are typically mild, including pink eye, rash, fever, headache, and joint or muscle pain. However, being bitten or infected while pregnant can result in pregnancy complications ranging from microcephaly, which is when a fetus's brain stops growing and their skull collapses inward, or even issues as severe as stillbirths. It was first identified in humans in 1952, but the first recorded outbreak wasn't until 2007. 70% of the island where the outbreak occurred's population came down with it, but all of the symptoms were mild and no one died. However, it then affected 30,000 in 2013 and 2014, and in these cases, the symptoms were much more severe. Next is the polio epidemic, occurring in the early 20th century. It permanently disabled many who had the disease. Many cases were asymptomatic. However, in case of ones that did display symptoms, there are 3 different variants. Abortive polio, which comes with mild viral symptoms, fever, headaches, sore throats, etc. Non-paralytic polio, which is like abortive but with a few added neurological symptoms. And paralytic polio, in which the patients become partially or totally paralyzed. Paralytic polio tended not to be permanent, but in rare cases, the patients never regained mobility. Some patients were confined to contraptions called iron lungs, which breathed for them. No cure has ever been found for it, but a very effective preventative vaccine has come out that has pretty much wiped out all cases of polio. However, a new and scarily similar illness called AFM, or acute flaccid myelitis, was reported in 33 states this year, according to the CDC. Then we have Ebola. This is one of the most notable modern epidemics. The 2014 epidemic of this disease was all over the news. 11,315 people have died of Ebola. Symptoms include fever, headache, aches, muscle pain, fatigue, diarrhea, vomiting, and bleeding. It is highly contagious, spread through bodily fluids, including saliva, sweat, and vomiting. It is also spread through touching objects that have been contaminated with these bodily fluids, or infected animals such as fruit bats. Even if you recover, you could still spread Ebola. Next, we have HIV and AIDS. Human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, which can later develop into the condition called acquired immune deficiency syndrome, aka AIDS or stage 3 HIV, is an ongoing epidemic, but the disease itself is now manageable thanks to medicine. As of 2016, it has killed 39 million people since the 80s. There is not yet a cure. It is transmitted through bodily fluids like blood, semen, breast milk, etc. However, not sweat or saliva unless these are contaminated with blood. Symptoms at their worst include constant fatigue, purple spots on skin, swollen lymph nodes, weight loss, bruising and bleeding, shortness of breath, yeast infections, fevers, night sweats, and diarrhea. And then we have the Black Death.
This plague is bubonic, B-U-B-O-N-I-C.
This is what most people think about when they think of an epidemic. There is no 100% accurate death count for every instance in which this has occurred. It was first seen as the plague of Justinian and was rumored to have killed 10,000 people in one day in the Byzantine Empire. It returned in the 14th century as the Black Death, killing 25 million people, which was 30 to 60% of Europe's population at that time. Then it occurred again in 17th century London for only a year, but killed 1/5 of London's population. Then again in the 19th to 20th century China. There are 3 different variations of this plague.
Bubonic.
The most common form, in which those ill develop buboes or swollen lymph nodes on their bodies. Also, please do not Google image search that, because I did it for you and it sucked really bad. Septicemic is the next kind that spreads in the bloodstream and is contracted via fleas or infected body matter. And then pneumonic is the final, passed airborne through coughed up drops of blood. And then we have malaria. Over 1 million people die of malaria on a yearly basis. 300 to 600 million people suffer from it every year. It kills one child every 30 seconds. It's a disease that is spread by mosquitoes. It has flu-like symptoms, and it's able to resist a lot of drugs, so it must be treated in its early stages. It's most often found in warm areas of the world, in over 100 countries and territories. Two of the largest malaria epidemics occurred during World War I and during World War II. And then we have cholera, a diarrheal disease. Its bacteria is spread through feces contaminating water and food, and it's rampant in places with poor sanitation. It sometimes even occurs in coastal waters and can be spread through uncooked and raw seafood. Most often, it's mild without symptoms, but severe cases can include diarrhea and vomiting that lead to dehydration and shock. Those who have this severe case can die within hours. 1.3 to 4 million die every year. And then we have smallpox. Smallpox goes all the way back to ancient Egypt. It has been pretty much eradicated, the last person dying of it in 1978, and the disease being declared no longer existent in 1980. There's been tons of outbreaks throughout history, however. The plague of Athens that brought about an end to the second phase of the Peloponnesian Wars, that was smallpox. The Antonine Plague and the plague of Cyprian in the Roman Empire were also smallpox. There was an outbreak in Western Europe in 581, an Indian epidemic in 400. There was an epidemic in Japan that killed 1/3 of the population in 1735 to 1737. And 1/7 of children in Russia died from smallpox. And it was the leading cause of death in the 18th century. Symptoms are a highly contagious rash consisting of tons of spots that evolve into sores, beginning in one's mouth and then developing from the head down to your feet. Kind of similar to chickenpox, but like chickenpox from hell. Then there's the Spanish flu, also known as the influenza of 1918. It occurred right after World War I and infected 1/3 of the entire world's population. The global casualties were estimated to be about 50 million, though some speculate that it goes up to 100 million. The influenza affected healthy people more so than it did the elderly and children. It was soldiers returning home that was thought to have contributed to the wide and fast spread of this disease. It had normal flu-like symptoms such as fever, nausea, diarrhea, but could easily develop into pneumonia. Lungs would fill with blood and then suffocate those sick, causing dark spots to develop on patients and turning them blue. Because it affected the respiratory system, it was spread through the air when those infected coughed, sneezed, or even spoke. And lastly, tuberculosis. 1.8 billion people are thought to be infected with TB. It is an airborne disease caused by the germ Mycobacterium tuberculosis that can affect any part of the body, but most often is found in the lungs. There are two variants, active and latent. Those infected with the latent version might not even be aware they are sick, but will carry a non-contagious form of the disease. Only 10% of carriers actually get sick. This symptomatic form, active TB, is characterized by weight loss, sweats, fever, fatigue, and when in the lungs includes coughing and often coughing up blood, as well as chest pain. TB also teams up with HIV, as the leading cause of death in those that have human immunodeficiency virus is currently TB. It is also currently the leading infectious cause of death, and unfortunately, some cases are drug resistant. In 2017 alone, there were 558,000 cases of drug-resistant TB. A little over 1 million die per year. So, how are diseases actually spread? There are two main categories for diseases that are able to spread, called infection or contagion. It's important to note that all diseases are infections, but only some diseases are contagious. Infectious diseases refer to bacteria or viruses spread by germs. Meanwhile, contagious diseases spread directly from person to person. Some infectious diseases that are contagious are like the flu, for example, an airborne disease that is passed by person to person through coughing or sneezing or talking. And then there are sexually transmitted diseases like HIV and AIDS, or HPV or herpes. And then sometimes diseases are also spread through contact with an object that is used by someone infected. For example, a disease that is infectious but not contagious would be malaria. That is because it is spread via environmental factors. Malaria is spread by mosquitoes, but you cannot contract malaria from contact with a person who has the disease. The disease currently worrying the World Health Organization is H5N1, also known as the avian or bird flu. We are in the alert phase of this potential pandemic. It is currently not contagious as it cannot be spread from human to human. It currently has a 60% mortality rate. It was first recorded in 1878, known as the foul plague. However, I do want to stress that you cannot catch this flu from eating cooked eggs. Bird flu symptoms in humans begin flu-like but escalate into a respiratory disease. It has also been observed to affect the brain and digestive tract of certain patients. Climate change is also another potential threat to public health and a big contributor to diseases. As our global climate increases, this creates a better environment for diseases such as malaria that thrive in warm climates to spread. Rising sea levels also pose an issue to the quality of water, making diarrheal diseases like cholera able to spread faster. You might wonder what the scientific tools we have for meeting these issues are. Vaccines are currently the best way to prevent an epidemic or pandemic. By using medicine to provide immunity against a disease, you are taking a step in the direction of preventing its spread. Quarantines are not always effective, and some scientists suggest doing nothing is less harmful than a quarantine. Our best method of epidemic prevention is vaccines. It is also important that scientists working against viruses and diseases, doctors, and humanitarian efforts all get proper funding. Scientists are able to spot and study diseases, and when able to figure out how they work, can decide the best response. Doctors and humanitarian efforts can go into areas in which these diseases are rampant and prevalent due to a lack of sanitation. It is not always possible to prevent outbreaks, and not all countries are even currently prepared to handle a large epidemic. However, it is possible to begin work toward being better prepared, and that is a global effort. Now, what is the appropriate ethical response to an epidemic? My answer is empathy. I think the best way to example why empathy is important in the face of an epidemic is to show a time in which it was absent. Given that the AIDS crisis is both fresh in the minds of many and that World AIDS Day was less than a week ago, the HIV and AIDS epidemic in the 80s and 90s is an excellent example of this ethical and medical failure. Reagan Surgeon General Dr. C. Everett Koop says that he was forbidden from speaking about AIDS and was actively withheld information regarding the disease. Many prescribed to the idea that the AIDS epidemic was an act of God's wrath, wiping out the gay community that suffered especially from this disease.
Does the President have any reaction to the announcement of the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta that AIDS is now an epidemic in over 600 cases? And over a third of them have died. It's known as gay plague. No, it is. I mean, it's a pretty serious thing that 1 in every 3 people that get this have died, and I wonder if the President is aware of it.
I don't have it. Are you? Do you?
You don't have it. Well, I'm relieved to hear that, Larry.
Do you?
I'm delighted. No,
You
I don't.
didn't answer my question.
Well, I just wondered,
How do you know?
does the President, in other words, the White House looks on this as a great joke.
This attitude continued into Bush's term, Bush forbidding some of the sex education that may have prevented the spread of this disease because it promoted homosexuality. When speaking of AIDS, Bush urged behavioral change to combat the HIV and AIDS epidemic. He continuously made efforts to cut federal funding for AIDS. They would also not release new medication until eventually forced by the AIDS activist groups ACT UP and TAG, despite the fact that azidothymidine was not all that effective. AZT was also the equivalent of what would today be over $17,000 and was toxic to many, having horrible side effects. Because of this, many people with HIV and AIDS sought after black market experimental drugs in an attempt to save their lives. The thing that made the AIDS crisis so especially awful was that people seemed to dehumanize those suffering from this illness. There was no compassion, there was no value of life. They forgot that these people were human beings, and because of that, they openly laughed in press conferences. They dragged their feet when putting legislation in place that would help the people who were dying. It reached a point in which a person died every 8 minutes. Diseases and epidemics have a way of bringing out the worst in people, placing self-preservation and even bigotry above compassion and above the strive to find a cure. The appropriate response to an epidemic is empathy. It is research, it is efforts in which we attempt to save people, not leave them to die.